Hi, I'm introducing myself. I've decided, I was asked. I'm Hanna Kops. I'm the head of experience at Transport for London. I head up the digital design team. That's what I do. So if you have any questions around it, you can ask me later. So over the last 3 years, we've built an in-house design team that entirely focuses on digital. We're about 15 designers now, that's including me, and they consist of very experienced designers that are strategic, so they shape the product roadmaps that we have, as well as very hands-on, so there's a lot of actual hands-on design work being done every day. We have launched one product, which is the TfL Oyster app. We haven't launched many other products yet because they are still being worked on, and I can't talk about them, obviously. But a lot of work went into building this really strong in-house team for very good reasons that I will talk to you about today. And that's because digital becomes increasingly important, and therefore the design of our digital products is increasingly important. Part of that sort of design team is a digital studio. You see some pictures here. So we engage a lot with academia. We work a lot with the art schools. We engage lots of our stakeholders, of course. So a lot of this is about collaboration, bringing in different stakeholders from across the entire organization into the design process. Obviously, we work with customers quite a bit, so we do a lot of research with customers and so on. So as you would in any sort of good design studio, I think it's worth mentioning that we decided very early on that we wouldn't have an internal sort of agency model, which a lot of design teams do in large organizations. They kind of play a supplier role to the business. We decided not to do that. And we very deliberately decided to own the experience. That means we have a service design approach, we have a strategic approach, but we're not responding to briefs. But we're co-designing the briefs themselves. That's very important. So we're really kind of taking responsibility for the design. And that is also to kind of ensure the quality of the design and to make sure everything's consistent and so on. Part of that story is that we had to move on from kind of building in the first instance and maintaining a website to really thinking about digital as something that's integrated into the physical experience and something that lives on many, many different channels, from digital displays to apps, that has to sort of work in a context where we have a very huge digital ecosystem of third-party apps, of course, so the Googles of the world, the city mappers, all the other apps that are out there, all the open street maps, all the sort of open platforms and so on. So for a very long time, as you may know, we had a very strong, we were one of the first transport authorities that had a very strong open data policy, and we still do. So all the data we publish is open. And for very good reasons, and we are committed to that. I'll come to that later, but we need to do more. We need to do more than that. One of the reasons why I do this is because, I see a lot of talks about design, but nobody gets credited. So I just wanted to make sure, it's kind of like making a huge film. There are a lot of people involved, and many of them are very, very good at what they do. And they don't get to do many talks, so here they are. In the context of maps, I would like to point out these 5 people. They're very special, and they're very involved in what we're doing around mapping, and are very sadly not here today. They wanted to come, but they can't. Have a quick look, yes? Okay. So, what am I going to talk about? This is Margaret Hamilton. I don't know if you know her. She is a fabulous woman, probably a genius. What she did was she wrote all of this code. This is all code that she wrote. Yes, books and books of code. You think of code something as something that's somewhere, yeah? I mean, some of you may actually be coders, but This is all sort of basically a long algorithm. What did she do with it? She prevented the abortion of the Apollo mission. And what I'm trying to say with this image is we talk a lot about algorithms and data, and it's all really, really, really important, obviously. But it's becoming more accessible. You know, I'm not saying that I know how to code a bit and so on, so it's becoming more accessible, but it is something that is not, hasn't had the impact that design has. So in order for everybody to participate and kind of use sort of algorithms, you really do need this. Yeah. We kind of stopped thinking about interfaces because it was very fashionable, 20 years ago, but nowadays really there's very little talk about it because we all kind of know how interfaces work, we kind of use them every day. But the design of interfaces is really, really crucial to how we interact with data and how we kind of shape cities nowadays. So this is why I have the first Apple Macintosh interface here, because, without that very first approach where you had really clear metaphors and so on, this digital revolution that we're now sort of part of and that we've seen over the last, 30, 40 years and so on, wouldn't have been possible. The reason why I talk about this is because one of the things that we did at TfL was to take this a lot more serious. To say we want to build a team that actually can build interfaces. And by that I don't just mean a UX team that sort of does a bit of research, puts some patterns together, and that's that. But actually thinking about interfaces more deeply and understanding what we can do with them. So, I mean, you know these geographic transit maps. So this is the London network projected against its sort of geography. And the reason why I talk about this is because this idea that sort of, when you go all the way out there, and I mean, I know you know this, but up there, that sort of purple line that goes out there, that is sort of in the hills, that's in the Chilterns. So I don't know if you know London, but if you're in London, this is really far out. They have hills there and woods and things, this is not London. But it kind of is London. And so what I'm trying to say is that, in order to navigate this really vast city and make people feel like they are part of London and not living somewhere where there are woods, you had to create something like this. So when sort of Harry Beck designed this, in order to make it easier to understand and so on, he not only sort of designed a really great piece of 20th century communication design, but he also really shaped the way that people in London identify themselves with the city. So in order for you to be a Londoner, you kind of have to be on that map, sort of. If you're not on that map, you're sort of not on the map. And what is really interesting, at one point, we'll have an Elizabeth line, and that Elizabeth line will go all the way up to Reading. And Reading currently is definitely not part of London. So it's really fundamental to what I mean when I say, and I think it's kind of like reflecting what Jacques said this morning. It's like the responsibility we have when we produce these maps, recreate these maps, work with these maps is immense, because we're really shaping people's relationship to their cities, and how they experience being part of it or not, let alone helping them to navigate this very, very complex environment. And then put it into a pocket. We think sort of the mobile phones are great, aren't they? But you know what? This was great in the 30s. So you had, for the first time, something you could put in the pocket and then feel part of London. So it's huge. All of this kind of, you may or may not know, is partly due to this man, who's Frank Peake. Frank Peake was immensely important. He was the chief executive of London's Passenger Transport Board at one point. He played several roles, and there are many books about him and so on. Actually, Mark wrote one, I think. Or did you? Or maybe not. But anyway, he turns up in your books as well, obviously. So yeah, he's a very important man, and that's because he kind of set up the design culture within TfL. So he kind of stands for a very kind of deep respect for design in our organization. And that's because he very early understood that transport really shapes the culture of a city. So infrastructure really is culture. And that includes everything, the architecture of the stations, yeah, but also the posters in the stations, but also the lighting in the stations, but also the way that people talk to each other. It also includes the fact that you have a map in the first place, that you can look at it and put it in your pocket and navigate the city easily and so on, that you can feel part of a city, that you have a typeface that's legible, yeah? That you have a wayfinding system, that you can find stations. So before he came on board and sort of made sure that this roundel was rolled up absolutely everywhere in London, it was hard to find a tube station. Couldn't really find them. They had all sorts of signage. Yeah. So this is the typeface, Johnson typeface, which you may know. So we're very used to these things, but they were fundamental to the way that London works as a city nowadays. And when we design for digital currently, so if I look at all the sort of things that are out there right now, digital for the longest time has sort of been an afterthought and has been slightly disconnected from that design history. That's not just in TfL, but it's just in general. And that's because we had to do lots of other things in digital. For example, we did have to think about data and algorithms and all sorts of things. And then designers sort of entered the field and started as sort of web designers, funny name. A lot of people in the digital world sort of started somewhere in between coding and design. Some were graphic designers, sort of didn't know what they were doing in digital, and it was kind of a mixed sort of bag. And I think we're just finding our feet in terms of what digital design really is, and what it means, and how we can integrate with that really long heritage that exists around wayfinding, yeah, around communication design, information design, and so on. And that's what my team does. That's what they do. They look at that typeface, they look at the map, they go out, they look at the signage, and they try to integrate and try to understand how we can sort of evolve this really very well-designed system into something that's digitally enriched and integrated. And that's important because it's about these moments. And so I wanted to talk a little about this road sign project that you also may know about. It's very famous. It's the British Road Sign Project. And it's famous because the typeface is quite famous. It's the transport typeface. But why it's also famous is because there was a huge discussion around this typeface at the time. And it was about the legibility of it. And there were lots of tests. And I think until now, we still don't know which typeface won. But anyway, this one won, obviously. But what was interesting about that conversation was the reason why this typeface was designed in the first place was to do this, to make it legible within about 4 seconds at an angle of 15 degrees and an average speed of 17 miles per hour. So now imagine you're on the street, you have this kind of, you're walking, you have this wobbly little phone in your hand. Yeah, you're looking at this map. It's really, really, really full with stuff. Every restaurant, every little nook and cranny, and you know, everything's on it. You're trying to find your way, and then you see a little bus thingy. Could be a bus, could be a tram, who knows? Yeah, and you're looking up, and you're looking sort of at the environment, and you see something else, some other sign, and you don't know. How do you relate what you see on the screen with what you see in the actual environment in about half a second? that relationship between our physical world and signage and so on hasn't been worked out. And so we kind of set that as our challenge. Can we create something that works across those two dimensions? Yeah? Can we have a really good mapping language, for example, that works across physical signage, non-digital signage, potentially digital signage, phones, yeah, interfaces on the phone, but then also you go home, you look at the desktop, and so on. So how does that whole sort of design system work together? So when we started to look at maps, and we started about, I would say, a year ago, we started to look at maps. And we've done a lot with sort of Google Maps on the website and so on, obviously. But you know, we started to look at schematic maps. We thought, okay, you know, we've got the tube map, we've got this really long history, and so on. What is this? What do we want to do with it? Does it lend itself for something digital? And the reason why I have this up here is because we look at the tube maps, the transit maps, as something, which they are. They are this kind of image of the city, and we're looking at it as a print product, right? We're looking at it as something that's whole, you know, at a glance, as you said this morning. And it's great because it is that sort of mental model that we have of a city, and that's very much the purpose of these maps. But then there are all these other little maps, these tiny little map fragments that are everywhere. You know, this is just one example, yeah? So it's the same sort of mapping language, but kind of not. So you may notice, you know, I don't know. We talked about this north and south and orientation. So here again, you're at Westminster and you're going down. You're not going south. You're going east. But the map is going down. So we're actually used to kind of constantly switching our perspectives in this context, and it's really interesting how we navigate that and how we use sort of little elements of that tube map, that schematic sort of design system, to orient ourselves across the network. And this is just one example. Yeah, there are many, many examples of this. And again, it's across sort of print and signage, and then somehow digital when you do it, when you use the journey planner, or you're planning something on Google or Citymap or whatever. Everywhere these little station, interchange icons come up, and the lines in between, and so on. Anyway. And then there are these other maps. Huh? These are the lift maps. They are very interesting. So this is, you're there. Yeah, you're in the red spot there in the middle, and they're very abstract, which is really interesting. They're kind of, highly schematic in a way, really diagrams. And you can sort of, if you need to go to street level, you have to kind of take the lift C and then the lift A and so on and so on. And they're everywhere. So maps are this idea of a diagrammatic sort of design language is absolutely ubiquitous across our entire network. So what we set out to do is to think about this as a digital platform. So what if we said we would like we would like to apply a schematic approach rather than say just create a schematic digital map. But we would like to create a platform that allows us to draw map fragments, map elements in whichever way we need them, on whichever platform or touch point we need them, in all sorts of ways. And it's all data-driven. Could we do that? So we started that process. And this is also because, it's what we also found is the tube map is one thing. Again, it's the image of the city, and then you've got sort of the signage and so on. But for example, mapping a station still, it's a huge question mark how we map stations. Yeah, do we map them like this, and then sort of just draw data through it? Do we sort of make them flat and just show levels, as you just saw on the example in the previous talk? Do we completely create abstract maps, or do we just show the relationships between, say, toilets and exits and lifts and so on? Do we do what they do in computer games? where you just show where you are and then what's around you. Yeah. So it's blue field, like blue sky thinking is needed. We don't know. But it needs to be worked out because these environments are highly complex to navigate, and not all areas in these environments are suitable for example, looking at the phone. So understanding where people look at the phone, standing maybe at a platform, hopefully when it's a bit quiet and not when it's completely crowded, and then looking at their phone and understanding where they are in a complex station. Because as Jack said this morning, this whole underground network is hidden. It's completely mysterious. When people enter a tube station, it's like entering a bubble. They literally do not know where they are anymore. They don't know where north is and east is, and they have no idea. It's just experience and asking around and finding a way somehow. That's all it is. And you probably know this from your own experience. So when we set out to do this, we started, of course, with what we have right now. So a lot of it is about, at the moment, a lot of it is still about how do you draw lines. Yeah? So I'm talking about all of these exciting things, but actually a lot of it at the moment is still how do you draw lines? How do you make curves? Because you realize all of these maps that we have are hand-drawn. So all these, all these kind of schematic, real schematic transit maps are hand-drawn. They're handmade. It's something we forget. We kind of can't believe that that's true, but they are actually made by someone who sits there and thinks, am I going to move this a bit to the left to kind of squeeze it in, and how's that label going to align, and so on. So a lot of the work that we're doing right now is just literally figuring out, okay, so labels, how are we going to position them? What if a label has to sit on the left and then on the right? What are the rules? As soon as you kind of do something programmatically, of course, you need to work out how, what the rules are. So there's a lot of math that's going on here, some heavy thinking. We've worked this one out, I can guarantee you. This one we know. The river. You may have noticed that the London River is broader and sort of narrower at different parts. And on the map it is actually broad and narrow. So how do you do this without sort of spending half a year coding? So what we did, what we're exploring right now is, so we made it all narrow. Now that's a bit easy. So we've introduced this idea. It's just an idea, exploration, yeah? You notice the curvature there? Yeah. It's getting a bit softer. And this one is a bit sharper. So we're trying to work out how can we sort of communicate that a river is becoming broader by just kind of having different levels of curvature. Yeah. So we need to sort of find ways to do this in code, without, at the moment at least, without changing the map too much. This is not to be underestimated. On the left-hand side, this is kind of what we have right now. That's our schematic transit map. Yeah, it's all nicely fitted onto a paper. It's difficult to fit it all on a paper, but it is on a paper. And then there are about 15 versions of this. There's a step-free one, there's a walking one, there's, all sorts, a night tube one, and so on and so on and so on. And suddenly, all that opens up. We don't have the edges of the paper anymore. And also, the interaction model changes completely. So right now, you have to fold it open. You can, open it like this, and then you have a front and a back, and it has a cover, and then you have a key, and then you have to kind of turn it to see the key, to understand what's on the other side. You kind of you learn sort of your ways around how to read that map. But that's not how digital maps work, obviously not. So here you've got now a digital map on the right-hand side, which is indefinite space and indefinite levels, zoom levels. You can zoom in and out of these things. You can go in and out. You can interact with them. So what do you do with that in the schematic world? So it's a very different way of thinking about schematic transit maps. And it's really opening up a lot of things that we need to explore, but very interesting opportunities within that. So for example, what if you zoomed in and you started to reveal other things? Parks, for example, or station environments, or Soho Square and Charlotte Street, or places of interest, yeah, or anything else. I mean, I leave it up. What if you zoom in and you zoom out of this map, and so on? I show you one little example that we also started to look at, which is how do you then transition? Is this then elastic? So in terms of design, suddenly we're getting into another level of complexity. So how does something work? How does something sort of interact with, you know, with your hands? If you're kind of moving it in and out, does it sort of, you know, if it doesn't just make it bigger, like in a PDF, but it actually responds to your touch, how does it feel? And then suddenly the question comes up, how does that relate to all our design language and our heritage again, our brand? Yeah. So transitions, states, animation, ambience. At the moment, a lot of transit maps still work with iconography, but iconography is very stiff. It's very sort of solid. It's not dynamic. How can we sort of, bring in live data, real-time sort of information into this map? So that's what we're doing. That's what we're exploring right now. You see how the little village comes up as well. So I mentioned brand, and it's kind of one of those things that we don't tend to talk about much in this world of transport and so on. But actually, it's really quite important. And again, does this kind of, how do we sort of make this work across? So this kind of movement that you have when you go in and out, is that sort of something that relates to us or not? Yeah. Can people recognize that it's from us? So this is the other opportunity. I talked about fragments real quick, and of course, now that we can draw any of the map elements, and we can draw it now, we can draw it in code. We've done it. We can draw the entire map in code. We can also draw all sorts of maps in code. We can, for example, at the moment already draw an entirely step-free map with only showing the step-free interchanges or showing all interchanges and so on. And you can imagine sort of the flexibility we're getting right now. So you could switch and not just sort of toggle on and off, but actually you could theoretically at the moment transition from one schematic map to another. You could, or you could create your own personal transit map. You could create your personal step-free transit map, in fact. You could create your own personal step-free transit map that's only showing the night tube. So it's all of these kind of things we can suddenly do, plus live data perhaps in there, and so on and so on. So it's opening up a huge set of opportunities for us. One other thing that it opens up is that we can show you where you are on that map. That's not easy to do. You think it's easy to do, but it's not. We can show you where you are, and we can maybe even show you how long it takes you to get to the station on a schematic map, mind you, or on a schematic fragment. And we can also potentially, we could, theoretically, we can actually do it, create a whole journey that's still slightly geographic in just a line diagram on the right-hand side that still shows you that you're going from southwest London to northeast London and using these two lines. which fits nicely on a very small screen. So it's that sort of opportunity that we're sort of starting to leverage in this, by kind of taking this seriously and looking at sort of a diagrammatic digital mapping language. I talked about the fact that we need to place you on it though, and I said that's not very easy. This is a simulator that one of our developers built to try to understand this. So this is the Bakerloo line, and yeah, as you see, that's the geographic, projection, and that's the kind of schematic one, and you see how different it is. It's really very, very different. And now you see here an example where you are in reality. Moves like this, somehow goes like this. So when you play this in parallel, it goes off on a little journey and moves like this. So working that out is quite tricky and quite interesting for us right now. That's it. You can ask me questions if you like. Oh.
So, that was an amazing presentation, and I'm really excited by all the things on which you're working. So, I used to be working for Transit App, and one of my job there was basically, let's add that new city. So, and I worked on London, and basically my boss was like, let's add London, it's Transit App. They have no idea what is happening there. They are from North America. And so I dive into all of that, and my job was to see how in one app we could localize it, by, for example, fighting and saying, we cannot abbreviate Bakerloo into back, nobody will get that. We have to change the way the app is being done so that it could be localized. And at the same time, keeping a consistency in the brand. And RATP spoke about that this morning, and I think that, that relationship is very interesting between the localization and the global way of speaking. So, those questions have already been tackled by different transit apps, and I think that would be interested to see the comparison, but it's just for the future. So my two questions are, how do you see your relationship with those entity and those UX designer which are working on the exact same question, but with a global scope?
Yeah,
and the second half of the question is that when we wanted to use the font, it was not open sourced, and we had to pay for it, and so we did not.
Yes.
So do you aim to open source the assets, the font, and the logos?
No. No. So I think that's a very interesting question. So, I mean, I'll give you a very high-level answer to all of this. And it's kind of, but it's not an answer, it's actually just kind of a stating of facts, and it's to be explored. One important bit is, so I did talk about the fact that we built a design team, that we're taking it very seriously, that we're building our products now, new products, and so on. But we're doing that to complement what's in the market, because we know that all the apps that exist out there are hugely beneficial for our transport network. So what Google have done, what CityMapper have done, what any of the other apps have done and services have done, has hugely influenced how people experience the network as much faster, as much more innovative. It's something that they can navigate, where they can get lost and find themselves via that little blue dot. So it's very important to understand when we talk about digital, TfL digital, it's something that where we kind of take all these other sort of services that people use to navigate a city. We see that as part of our ecosystem, if you will. It's a digital ecosystem that people use to navigate. And our products, whatever they will be part of that. Yeah? And so we have to take this question very seriously. What do we add then? what's different to what we would be doing, or why would we do any of this, and so on. And I think there is a huge responsibility that we have. We have a huge responsibility for accessibility, for inclusion, yeah, for the environment, for multimodal integration. And there are things that we are very invested in and are very interested in, and that we need to work for people. We need to work this out for people. We need to make sure they know. For example, we talked about hidden infrastructure. We need to make sure people know sort of how to get from a train onto a bicycle easily. And that's not currently that straightforward. So people kind of know how to cycle and people kind of know how to use a train, but to do both, it's not that easy in London. And so I guess for us it's really important to focus on that and to focus sort of on making the city work in a way that we feel is important, together with people, with our customers. And for that integration of the physical infrastructure with digital is absolutely key. And that's something that only we can do. So only we have our displays, our digital displays in the stations. Only we can connect people with staff, yeah? So only we can sort of put things into our stations, like, you know, any sort of proximity technologies, for instance, and so on. So there are things that kind of enable us in different ways to enrich the environment digitally. But that doesn't mean, you know, that it can't work altogether. And that's, I think, how we see it. So, and then I do think on that global level, that sort of global sort of consistency is also important, and it's also interesting. So if I travel a lot, for example, and I need to go from city to city, of course, it's hugely reassuring if I had like sort of one design language that would tie all of that up. Yeah, but equally so, it's really important that if you're in London and you see the signage on the street and you find the tube station and you find the bus stop and you're at the bus stop, you know, if you have a bus hub, you have lots of bus stops and you need to find the letters and you're looking up again and it's not reflected in the app, those exact letters with those exact sort of round sort of shapes around the letters, it's really difficult to understand where this bus stop is. So that's kind of where we can add real value by making that work really well and integrated. Not sure that answers your question, but yeah.
Okay, anyone else? We'll go to Peter and then go.
I am interested in the use of gestural input to digital maps. There's a guy called Eddie Jabbour who's got been maintaining for a long time a map of New York City, where, as you showed briefly on your presentation, when you zoom in with your fingers on the screen, it goes into higher detail and shows you a lot of information, layers of information that aren't there at the higher scale.
Yeah.
And also you're tapping on an individual station, you flip over into local street map. Now, as Yo was saying this morning, there's a lot of layers of information of intermodal travel which are there to be displayed, and it's difficult to get onto one map. On the other hand, modern touchscreens have got a lot of gestural inputs built into them, swirling around and blah, blah, blah. I was wondering what work you were doing to marry those up together, the layers of information and gestural input, beyond just zoom in and zoom out.
We're thinking about it. At the moment, zooming is already interesting enough. But we have been thinking a lot about sort of sequencing of elements coming in and so on, and how that all works, and in general, the entire interaction with a map beyond just zooming. Yes, there are lots of questions to be answered. So that's all I can say. I mean, the problem with gestures, if you are, what's always problematic with gestures is that people just don't necessarily know what they are. So they have to be gestures that they are fairly familiar with. So we're trying to, in general, not go too wild with gestures. We had one experiment where you could sort of just, with, I think it was with 2 fingers perhaps, go to the left, to the left, and kind of like reveal reveal the interchanging lines. So unfortunately, I don't have that example, but imagine you have a straight line and you would kind of swipe to the right, and then here the line colors would appear, the lines that connect to that. So there is a lot that you can do with that, and it's very interesting because it would reveal things and levels of complexity that would otherwise clutter the screen. So we're very interested in exploring these things, but we're also aware of the fact that not all these gestures are always known. So it's a balance we need to strike there. Yeah, we're very interested in generally in exploring audio maps, because audio maps are very difficult to do. Just reading out a map doesn't really work. So how do you do maps for people who can't see? Input, voice input. So we're very interested in all these kind of new emerging technologies that are in that space as well. That's another point that is worth mentioning, that the design team is also continuously looking at innovation as well, as sort of, so it's exploration, innovation, but also delivery, all tied into one team. Yeah.
Yo.
It's always fabulous to see how we run on parallel tracks. It's very interesting to see all your explanations, which are not exactly the same words we use, but they point the same issues. On the list of the skills you have described on your design team, there was not architecture. So
what sort of architecture? Like actual architecture? Like architecture?
Yeah, architecture. Yes. So does it mean that the team is dedicated to digital?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is about the link between digital and physical life and design, because you have also told about that.
Yeah.
I have many questions, but only one for now. Did you already identify some consequences from the digital world towards the physical world? You have explained just now that the lettering of the bus stops, it was difficult to implement that in the digital world. Okay, but it is an adaptation of the digital world which is necessary. But sometimes, with the digital function and services which can be delivered, you can see that, you can guess that if the physical space was a bit different, or a bit, some objects were different, some spaces were not organized the same, it would be much easier. Did
Absolutely.
you already begin to identify this type of consequences?
Yes. So yes. So the way that we see it is that so what we need. So first of all, just to kind of respond to you, I think it's absolutely fundamental that one of the things that are very important to us is that we're thinking of digital as something that is really intertwined with the physical world. It's not something separate. And that's still fairly new, interestingly. You would think it's kind of, it should have kind of come across by now that cities are massively changing, that environments are hugely sort of impacted by anything that's digital. But it's still sort of a mindset that's new. So so we see this as absolutely one. So that experience is one, whether you're sort of looking at something digital and interacting with it, and the context you're in, and that environment you're in, and how that all is designed as a whole. However, and in that, we have also come across a lot of sort of instances where, and I give you one example, where we need to start having those conversations, and where that sort of collaboration needs to start in the wider sort of design ecosystem of TfL. So we do have contact with pretty much all other design teams, and we're working with them on things like that. And to give you one example, until very recently, the design of the digital screens, one of the digital screens, the one that shows the status updates, has been pretty much designed in isolation. So it was designed as a, as a kind of, screen that updates itself, but essentially could stand anywhere. And one of the first things that we did when we looked at redesigning those potentially was, where are they in the environment? So at what decision points along a journey in a station are they actually placed? And how can we then enrich it through data? Yeah, how can we enrich and localize that moment, that digital interface for that moment? And interestingly, a lot of the placements were determined by where the plugs were. And that's a very interesting, real physical limitation that you have. There's a plug, I'll plug it in, there's a screen. Whereas we were thinking, no, that you need the screen where you need to make that decision, where you need that information, and so on. So we had to kind of work that out. So we kind of realized that we may not be able to move those screens just freely just yet. So if we have to work with that limitation, how can we sort of increase the distance between the screen and the user? And how large does the type then have to be for it to be glanceable from, say, 5 meters away through sort of a busy group of people? Yeah, so you're standing here, lots of people walking around, it's really busy, there's a screen somewhere there. You really need to see what's on that screen. We can't move the screen just yet. Yeah? Can you still see what's on there? So it's kind of a dance. Next is, okay, well, where would those optimal places be in a station where people actually have time and enough room and to digest information? How small do the screens have to be? How big, how integrated? And so on and so on. And what are the optimal spots? And that should really be, determined by data and by qualitative research, and then by a very thorough process of digital design integration. So and that's the sort of, it's a way of working that we're sort of establishing with that. So yeah, it's one context, isn't it? It's one context. Yes.
Anyone else? Okay. You like to see me run around. Let's do it.
We have a term for it, actually. We call it anchoring. Yes.
That's why I chose to sit here. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. That's really impressive. And I'm also coming from a city that is also a very large city and has a very complex public transport network. It is Moscow, and I know that many people in Moscow DOT are very inspired with what TfL is doing, because the level of complexity we are dealing with is getting closer and closer to the level of complexity in London. And having said so, I think I'd like to reiterate the question that Mr. Kamenagai addressed to Mr. Jukanovic during his presentation. What do you think about the problem of keeping different layers of representing different layers of public transport system? Do you think it's possible to make legible and clear, understandable public transport map that would contain not only the TfL rail services, but also, like, I don't know, primary bus services or non-TfL rail? Do you think that some of what you've just shown us, like, I don't know, the zoom in idea, the zoom in concept with different levels of detail, do you think there may be some solutions that, from digital standpoint, that would help us to convey better the super complex public transport networks of extremely large cities like London or Moscow or any other similar city? Thank you.
Yes, I think so. Yes, I don't think it's easy, but I think taking a diagram approach helps hugely. For example, one of the things we're starting to experiment with is to show the cycle superhighways that we have in London in conjunction with that diagram now. So if you trying to find, yeah. So, well, too bad I don't have this here as an example, but imagine, this is the tube map. Well, imagine, there are several stops now, yeah, several interchanges. What we did, we started to draw the supercycle highways. They're currently being worked on to integrate them more and so on. So, but in short, imagine there are these kind of cycle superhighways that allow people to be a lot faster on their bikes, yeah, and kind of go long distances. They are perfect for sort of commuters who actually want to say cycle to work. Their infrastructure we've invested hugely into, and they're great. They're difficult to find because they're not on the map. They are on some maps, but they're not on these maps. And interestingly, the wayfinding signage is actually semi-geographic, semi-schematic. So they're sort of already lengthy, if that makes sense. So there are, if you're looking at the street totem, you would see sort of the cycle superhighway, and it's the same with the quiet way, it's another concept that we have in London. And it's just long, and the sort of stations that are related to it, and the kind of places of interest are sort of around it. So there's sort of diagrams as well. And interestingly, you can actually map them really nicely against the schematic tube map. It works really well. So it's possible, for example, to show where you could sort of take a bike on that cycle superhighway and then sort of hop onto a train in one map. Buses is more tricky, but you know, I definitely think, again, having freedom in terms of how geographic something has to be helps a huge amount with that. You know, it really then becomes information design, and it's definitely opened up a lot of space and opportunity, especially if you do think about the depth and the sort of gestures we can work in. So, yeah, I think it's possible, because we don't have to only work with a piece of paper. It is a multi-dimensional thing, this digital world, sort of. It's yeah. Any more questions?
Any more?
Just the last thing you said about the piece of paper, as you have another dimension to work with, how do you think the paper would work instead? I mean, it would be complementary, so I think it will still exist, but maybe playing a different role or something?
Yes, for example, the really beautiful thing is, now that we have this digital, data-driven, schematic mapping language, we can print out personalized maps for you.
Thank you.
At the station, if we wanted to. Yeah. That would be one of the differences. So we're already, just so that you know, we're already working very closely with the teams that manage the print side of our maps. And there's a lot of collaboration going on, and I foresee quite a bit of sort of influence the other way around. So we've taken everything that was there up until now, we've digitalized it, we've thought it through, we've adopted it, we've made a few sort of slight changes because it's a different environment we're designing in. And now vice versa, it's starting to influence the way that people think about those print maps in those other teams and what we may want to do with them in the future. And like I said just now, I think it's one integrated design environment. And definitely print maps will continue to play a role, but possibly a very different role. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Hanna.
That was it? Yeah.